Before we get going, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Roland Robles. I'm one of the engineers here on staff with MLC CAD Systems. I also have one of my coworkers on the webinar to help me answer any questions as we go. So when you have any questions, just feel free to type them in, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So in today's webinar, what we're going to be looking at is the benefits of using SOLIDWORKS PDM. And the way that we're going to be doing that is we're going to be covering three essential topics here. The first topic we'll be talking about is just getting started with PDM. Then we'll look at the implementation overview, which is essentially how do you use PDM, how do you get it installed, what does that process look like? And then the last thing we'll look at before we round out our webinar for the day is the upgrade path between the different PDM products that are available to you guys, the customers. So first thing is let's just define what PDM actually is. So what is PDM? PDM stands for Product Data Management, and it's a way to organize and control all of our important engineering information. The way that I like to equate this to anybody who asks me about what PDM is I like to think of PDM as a bank vault. It's a secure place to put all of our data, whether it's SOLIDWORKS data or other technical data, in a safe location that we can get access to and that we can track efficiently. The benefit of PDM is so that way you can share your data amongst departments and amongst your technical people that are creating these data. On top of that, unlike putting files in a normal Windows Explorer environment where we don't have complete control and security over those files, PDM gives us the ability to control and secure our files through what we call a workflow. So that way we can track our content as we're creating it and as we're releasing it to the people that need it. So PDM, what is it built on? What does it do? What can I put in there? With every seat of SOLIDWORKS Professional or SOLIDWORKS Premium comes a seat of what we call PDM Standard. And what PDM Standard is built for controlling and organizing all your SOLIDWORKS files, which would include SOLIDWORKS parts, assemblies, and drawings, and any other non-CAD package files that you might need. For example, say you're using AutoCAD and using DXS and DWGs, or maybe you're creating instruction manuals or content or programs for your manufacturing facility. All of that information, any file that you can see in a Windows application, you can actually put in PDM. PDM can be used to store and manage any file type, which would include SOLIDWORKS, AutoCAD, and all your Microsoft applications that you would be using like Word, Excel, or PowerPoint. So why do you need PDM? That's the golden question that most people ask me is, hey, Roland, why do I actually need that? The first main reason why anybody who's using SOLIDWORKS should be using PDM is because PDM gives you the ability to manage and control your references of a SOLIDWORKS file. So let's take a look at what that literally means. So what I'm going to do is I'm right now inside SOLIDWORKS, and I'm looking at a SOLIDWORKS drawing. Now, let's lay out some foundation first. The foundation of a SOLIDWORKS drawing in this case is this SOLIDWORKS assembly. This SOLIDWORKS assembly is actually composed of multiple parts. These parts, in this case, there's actually going to be 5 different parts, and these parts are created and designed by different people. So why is that important, and why do we care about that inside SOLIDWORKS? Well, every SOLIDWORKS assembly and every SOLIDWORKS drawings has what we call references. So for example, if I were to come up here and I go to File, Find References, what you're seeing right here on my screen is the fact that this drawing is referencing this assembly. This assembly, in turn, is referencing these piece parts. The reason that is important is if you were to go and rename one of these piece parts, or move one of these parts, or rename the drawing, or rename the folder, or move the folder that these parts are in, what would happen is the next time that you open up this drawing, it would shoot out an error. And many of you might have seen that error. The error looks something like, cannot find the part. Would you like to find the part manually or suppress the part? The reason is Windows Explorer by itself cannot manage these references because those references are embedded inside the actual file. And so that's what PDM does at the core of it. PDM manages those references for you. So as you're renaming files or organizing your files for SOLIDWORks, those references would automatically get updated, which is a huge task when we're working with 3D files. Second reason, why do I need PDM? Is we know that we need a history of all of our technical data. For example, when we create a drawing, we might make that drawing and then maybe 6 months later, our customer asks us to make a change. So we make a change, then we make the drawing some more, then 6 months later, they ask us to make another change. Well, along those lines, a lot of the times we need to reference what we've done in the past. So how do we physically do that currently in SOLIDWORks? Most people inside SOLIDWORks will do something like a file pack and go. And they might actually create a bunch of duplicates and they might manually track the revision. The problem with that is it is very labor intensive and you end up creating a lot of redundant information that is not streamlined. Using PDM gives you the ability to track your history directly inside SOLIDWORks and in Windows Explorer. So let me show you what that actually looks like. When I'm looking at this drawing, you'll notice that while I have my PDM turned on, I can see all of my versions. These versions are anytime I make a change. So for example, version 1 was me creating the file. Then I changed a few things, and then you'll notice it says A, which is actually tracking what we call a revision. So we're tracking both what we call versions and revisions. We'll come back to revisions here in a little bit. I then made another change, which was a version 5, and then I did another approval, which ended at revision B. What that gives me the ability to do is at any point in time, I could come in here and choose an old version and see what that file looks like. Likewise, a lot of the times, people who are not using SOLIDWORks need to see that history. So PDM is built on Windows Explorer. What you'll notice is when I navigate over to Windows Explorer, I'll see my PDM folder, and I'm going to navigate to where I saved that document. So in this case, I'm an engineer, so I'm going to go to my engineering folder, I'm going to go to my design folder, and there's my drawing. Without having to do anything special, while leveraging PDM, I can right-click on this drawing and see the history. This history gives me a hierarchy of who did what and when they did it. So for example, I can see who created this file. I can see the fact that they made a few changes. I can then see that the fact that they approved this file. And that's where we got our official revision A. After our approval, we made some more changes, and then we approved it again, and it ended at revision B. So from one file, from one truth, I'm able to track all my history using PDM without doing any redundant actions like a pack and go. The third reason that anybody who's using SOLIDWORks or creating any kind of technical information is they should be controlling their process. So let me lay out the scenario. I used to run a sheet metal manufacturing facility, and we would create a lot of drawings. Before we could physically make the drawing out on the shop floor, we had to have a few layers of approval. Our customer had to review the drawing, make sure they liked it. Our engineering manager had to review the drawing, make sure that we weren't missing anything that was key to the design. And then at which point we would actually produce the drawing for our manufacturing team. So how do we control that in just normal Windows Explorer? Well, most people don't. And that's where we get into trouble, where a lot of times we'll see drawings get released before they're actually ready, or even worse of that, our drawings are approved, but nobody knows that they're ready to go. So how can PDM help us actually do that? Well, what I want to show you is I want to show you in PDM what we call a workflow. So in this case, inside my personal PDM vault, what you're seeing on my screen is the current workflow for me approving an engineering drawing. So here's how it works. When I create a new engineering drawing, you'll see that my drawing starts off in a workflow state called under editing. The really powerful thing about this workflow is at this point in time, only the people that are in my engineering group get access to this drawing. What that means is I don't have to worry about my manufacturing guys getting their hands on a drawing before the drawing is actually ready to be made. Once somebody on my engineering team is done designing the drawing, they will then submit that drawing for approval. And in my organization, what that means is that one of our engineering managers reviews the design, reviews the drawing, and then makes an executive decision. That decision would be they can require a change, or if the drawing looks good, they can go ahead and pass that drawing for approval. And what happens is that drawing now gets opened up to the rest of the organization. What that means is now somebody from my manufacturing team can log into PDM and they can see that approved drawing without me having to worry about if the drawing is ready to go. And they don't have to worry about if it's the latest, greatest drawing. So PDM provides that for you. What you'll notice is when I'm in Windows Explorer and I'm looking at my drawing, you'll see that this drawing is in a state called approved, meaning that this drawing is ready to be made. On top of that, if I go back in here to my history, we can see that PDM is tracking that process. So you'll notice that it went from under editing, waiting for approval, and then it went from waiting for approval to approved, at which point it became revision A. So I'm automating the process of approving my technical data. The fourth and final reason that people need PDM is we know that when we're working with more than one person, we need to have a central location for this file sharing. So that way people can find the data they need and they can search for the data they need. Well, PDM is built on Windows Explorer. What that means is that anybody that we give access to can come to this PDM folder and they can access all of the information that we need them to access. The way they do this is like any other folder by simply double clicking, and then when they find something they like, they can single click on it. The benefit of PDM is the fact that when we select a document, in this case a drawing, from Windows Explorer, they can access a lot of that technical information that we see inside SOLIDWORKS without actually being a SOLIDWORKS user. For example, they could see a preview of my drawing. I'm capturing all my important information in what we call a data card. They can see the history of the drawing. If this drawing has a bill of material, from this bill of material tab, they can see the bill of material of the drawing. And then for us that are using SOLIDWORKS, we can actually see and manage our references. For example, I can see all the files that this drawing is referenced. And if I were to click on one of the sub items, I could actually see where that item is being used. So for example, this item called ratchet is being used in this sub-assembly, which in turn is being used in this drawing. The big benefit for that is that now there is no confusion on where to go and find a document. Everybody in the organization is going to go to the same place, see the same document, and see the same history. It eliminates all of that manual management that your users or you yourself are having to do. These are the four main reasons that anybody who's using SOLIDWORKS and creating technical documentation should be using PDM. Obviously, there's a lot of other functionalities that people can take advantage, but these are the core of anybody doing any kind of engineering or technical design, what they need to be capturing on a day-to-day basis. Some of the other tools that come with PDM is the fact that it gives you a secure interface. So for example, since we're putting our documents in a Windows Explorer folder that is PDM, we could control when and who can get access to that. On top of that, since we're working out of a central location, PDM uses what we call a database, which we'll cover here in a little bit. That gives us the ability to search and find technical information that I've already created, which helps you reuse that data as you do more design. Since we're working from one central location and all of our history is built into one file, you're generally going to see a faster throughput from your end user perspective because they're not having to go find things in multiple locations. One of my favorite things that's very near and dear to my heart is to ensure our compliance. Since we're using a workflow, In my old company, we were ISO registered. We had to prove that we were following our processes. So since we have a workflow that's documented, and this is the way our permissions are set up, and I can export that history out, this helps me in my process audits when I went through my ISO registration. Sharing data, obviously, since this is all in one central location, it gives us easy tools to share the data with non-technical people, people not using SOLIDWORks. And then obviously it's scalable. So since it's built on Windows Explorer, whether you're 1 user or 1,000 users, it's very easy to scale up or scale down on an as-needed basis. With that said, let's kind of talk about the different levels of PDM. So most people don't know they actually already own PDM. A lot of my clients and a lot of my customers, when they meet me or when they talk to me, they say, oh, how much is PDM? How do I, which one do I need? Well, let me outline this. That way everybody on this webinar will have a good understanding of the different layers of PDM. The first layer is what we call just Windows Explorer, and that's just your personal file management. That would be like having a folder on a server that you've mapped, and you're just saving your stuff on a folder, or maybe you're just saving it to your local drive. And not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, it's just not the most optimal way to store our data. The second level is a tool called PDM Standard, which is probably why most of you guys are on this webinar. PDM Standard is a license that comes with SOLIDWORKS Professional and SOLIDWORKS Premium. So if you know that you own SOLIDWORKS Pro or SOLIDWORKS Premium, you actually own PDM Standard. For every license that SOLIDWORKS Pro or Premium you own, you have one license of PDM. This is what we like to call work group management. And so what the sweet spot of this is in our engineering team. When you have multiple people that are using SOLIDWORKS and you need them to be working the most effective way, it is best to be putting that SOLIDWORKS content and that technical content into a PDM vault for those main 4 reasons that I just talked about. The next level on top of that is kind of our enterprise management tool, and we call that PDM Professional. This is really the sweet spot for that is when we're getting outside of just our technical SOLIDWORKS data, and now we're wanting to manage other kinds of processes and other kinds of workflows, and maybe we're scaling our organization up where it's just not 2 or 3 people. There's a lot more functionality built into that tool, what we call PDM Professional, that helps us manage a larger organization. And then our 4th data management tool is what we call SOLIDWORKS Manage. And that's what we call a project and item management tool. So that tool actually has specific project functionality and what we call item functionality that helps us manage not just a CAD file, but the overall process of the overall project for an organization. So these are our 4 layers of PDM. Most people, obviously, everybody is using Windows Explorer in some form or fashion if you're using SOLIDWORKS. But most of my customers, believe it or not, have PDM Standard and they just don't know it. So if you fall in that category, you're right in the right location. You're in the perfect location for kind of getting started. With that said, a lot of people say, oh, I don't need PDM. I'm using ERP. Or they say, oh, I have an MRP tool. I don't need PDM. And so I want to kind of outline where PDM fits in the life cycle of an organization. So most people have all these requirements, like they have requirements for RFQs and issue management and PLM tools and project collaboration. But PDM's sweet spot is really in that design and concept phase. That's for collaborating with your engineering team, tracking your engineering change process, right, like the ECR, ECO, ECN process, and reusing your product knowledge, right? So this is tracking your actual files. Those other tools are great tools that are necessary, but they're kind of outside the scope of actually controlling the actual document. That's the sweet spot of PDM. Now, say, all right, Roland, all this sounds great. I need to control my references for my CAD data. I have multiple users. I need to track my process. I need to see the history of the file. So what do I do, right? You might say, hey, I have SOLIDWORKS Pro. I'm not using PDM Standard. So what's the next step? So here's the 4 things that we're going to cover in the next 10 or 15 minutes. Who should be involved in implementation? What resources you would need for PDM? What to kind of expect during an implementation, and what are the kind of things to look out for when you're implementing a PDM software. So the first thing is what are your resources? Before you ever install software, specifically PDM, we want to identify your key stakeholders. So for PDM, that usually kind of falls into three people: your engineering team, or the people in charge of your engineering team, like your engineering manager. Usually they have some sort of requirement, for example, who should be approving or who should be reviewing documents. The second key stakeholder that we usually want to bring in to the loop is usually the end users, people that are using SOLIDWORKS, right? They usually have some ideas, and we want to understand how they actually work. How do they create parts? How do they create assemblies? How do they name things? And then the third kind of level of group is people who need to access the data that aren't creating the data. For example, this would be like, say you had a machine shop and you had your machinist out on the shop floor and he's fixing to write some code to machine a new part that you've designed. A lot of the times he needs that part and he needs the drawing that has all the product manufacturing information. So understanding what his requirements are is huge. We really want to understand that when we're setting up PDM. The second kind of resource that we need kind of falls into the IT department. Since we're leveraging a new software, generally speaking, we want to make sure that we have a server to put this information on. The server is going to actually be the brain of the operation, and we'll talk about that here in a second. The third resource is your client workstations. Obviously, if you're already using SOLIDWORKS, perfect. You probably already have machines set up that can use PDM. PDM is built on Windows Explorer, so all you would need is a up-to-date Microsoft operating system, and you could be accessing PDM. And then the last kind of resource that we generally need is we need some sort of IT or systems support. So when we're setting up PDM, we need to be able to, generally speaking, have admin rights, so that way you can actually install the software. We need to be able to make sure that we can configure the networks, that way your clients can talk to the server. And in some cases, there's special environments where there's some other security that we need to take into account for, and IT is usually the group that kind of helps us or gives us those parameters. So let's start off by talking about what we call an implementation, right? Now, an implementation is literally just the process of getting PDM up and running, and it falls into kind of four basic categories. When we do an implementation for a customer, we generally start off in 5 days. Now, that's just kind of an overall amount of time. We're not necessarily saying it's going to take 5 days, but that's kind of how we break this down. Depending on your organization and the requirements, sometimes, and a lot of the times these days go down in quantity. Sometimes they go up in quantity because it takes longer because there's more people that are involved. But I wanted to show you this because it gives you a really good overview. The first thing that we generally are going to do in an implementation, anybody, whether it's you're doing it yourself or you're using a reseller or a partner to help you implement, step number one is usually getting the software installed on both the server and the clients. Generally speaking, you can look at dedicating about a half day's worth of time to getting all the software installed. So what does that process actually entail? There's 5 components that have to get installed to set up PDM. The first component that you have to install is what they call the license manager. So this is actually a really great benefit of PDM. If you're obviously a SOLIDWORKS user, probably you already are because you're on this webinar, you know that there's 2 kinds of SOLIDWORKS license. There's what they call standalone licenses and network licenses. And let me explain those. Standalone licenses is you have one license, you put it on one machine, and you use it on that machine. Network license is when you have a pool of licenses. So when you start SOLIDWORKS, checks your license out, you use it. When you close SOLIDWORKS, puts the license back. PDM always uses what they call network licensing. That way, you can get the most efficiency out of your licensing for PDM, meaning more people can access PDM and share the same license. So first step number 1 in the installation is we have to install the license manager. Step number 2 is PDM is built on what we call a database. The database that we use is actually called SQL, Microsoft SQL. It is a very familiar, it's a very popular database tool, and so that tool has to be installed on a server that all your clients will be connecting to. We'll come back to what the database does here in a second. The third and fourth steps that you're going to see are what they call the PDM services. So on the server, there's a software that's running. We call that the archive and the database software. PDM archive service, PDM database service. That's the brain. That's actually when a client logs in and checks a file out or does an action, that's what's controlling who's doing what, and that's what's making it efficient. And then the fifth thing that's part of that installation process is actually installing the client software on the client machine. So if you're already a SOLIDWORKS user, what that means is we would modify your SOLIDWORKS install and include the PDM add-in. If you're not a SOLIDWORKS user, so maybe you have guys that need to access, or gals that need to access PDM, and they don't use SOLIDWORKS. So we would install what we call a contributor license or a viewer license. That gives them the ability to access PDM without actually having to need a SOLIDWORKS specific license. So what does that look like? Let's start off with the server. On the server, we're going to install two services. The service on the right is what we call the file server. The file server, think of that as your bank vault. That's your safe. When you check a file in, it goes into a secure location, and that right there is controlling the physical file, the part, the drawing, the assembly, the PDF, fill in the blank. The second, what we call service, is what we call the SQL server. That's housing what we call metadata, which is just a fancy way of saying that's all the other information that is not the actual physical file that you're seeing on the screen. That would be like the history of the file. For example, who changed it, who approved it, who revised it. That would be all like your descriptions. What's the description of the part? What's the material? What's the part number? Revision, that's your history. Who created it, who changed it. All of that information, that's all what they call metadata, and that all gets housed into a SQL server. The benefit of this is these two services talk to each other, so that way things work more efficiently. So for example, if you were opening up a large assembly in a normal environment, it might take a little bit longer than opening it up in PDM, because PDM is actually segmenting these files out and managing them more efficiently than a normal Windows Explorer structure. So what happens with the client? How does this work between the server and the actual end user? What happens is when an end user just goes to file open, just like they're used to in SOLIDWORKS, when they open that file up, the server says, okay, Roland is opening a new file. He's never opened this file before, and he checked it out. And it puts that file on my system, and it gives me write access. So then when somebody else wants to access that, what happens is they can open it up without having any error messages or warnings, and they would get read access. And so what's happening here is in a multi-user environment, we're actually able to work more efficiently together because this database and this archive is controlling who's doing what, and it gives it a lot more seamless workflow when you're working with CAD documents. The awesome thing about this is during an implementation, you don't need to know how to do every step. That's what we're here for. So we have all this documented, and obviously we have a lot of experience setting up these PDM vaults. So we teach you on how to install the software, and we teach you on how to set up that network configuration. And while we're teaching you, we generally are doing the work for you. So by the time we're done teaching you all the installation, your network is actually installed and set up. So what's the next step in the process? So line item 1, server installation and software and all the clients now installed. What do you do next? The next thing is we need to understand how to administer PDM. When I say administer, what that means is we need to create users and groups and workflows, and we need to set up the permissions that control who can do what in our organization. So what does that look like? Generally, during that implementation, what we do is we have a conversation and we talk about what are your goals and your objectives. So these are the most common things that we're going to hear. Most people say, hey, I create a lot of redundancy. We have products and we create, 100 products and they all look the same. I want to be able to reuse things more efficiently. Second goal that we hear a lot is we have no control over what the current revision is. That's probably the most common thing I get is people come in and say, Roland, I got 5 drawings. They're all revision B. They all look different. I don't know which one is the right one. Automating, right? So automating that workflow. When they say, okay, Roland, I come in on site with a customer and they say, look, we never know when the drawing is done. We get emails and we go find this guy and we do this and all these other ancillary things, and it's just not an efficient way to do it. That fourth goal that we're generally achieving is they want a centralized location to get their data and be able to share the data. So what does that admin training look like? During your installation and during your configuration, what you're seeing on my screen right now is what we call the admin tool. This admin tool, once we install everything, we go through the process and show you how to create users, groups, workflows, and all the other supplementary information that you would need to use your system. What we do is we take our 20 plus years of setting up PDM and we take your goals and we help you actually build that. During that configuration, here's the things that you're going to need to be setting up. You want to set up what we call data cards. So what is a data card? A data card is how we capture information about a file. For example, this drawing, I have a drawing number, I have a description, I have a revision, who created it, a document number. All this needs to get set up. We help you define and set that up for you. It's creating the vault, right? That's the actual, what you want to name it, who can check in and who can check out. All of the metadata, all those variables that you see in that data card, we're going to configure for you. My most important thing is setting up that workflow. So during this administration and during this configuration of PDM, we're going to show you and we're going to build that workflow for you. In this case, this is my workflow. And so what I have here is this is how I work in my organization. Now, once we have all that admin and all that configuration done, what's the next step in the process? The next step in the process is usually going to be what we call in-user training. So what does that consist of? Let's take a look. We have a baseline PDM in-user training that we go through. The awesome thing about an implementation is if we take this baseline, which is an official training class, and what you're seeing right now on the screen is the syllabus of the information that we cover. And generally it takes about a day. The great thing about an implementation is we usually condense this information in a more efficient manner and we tailor it to your actual vault. For example, the PDM concepts, those are pretty much general and generic across everybody, understanding the concept of PDM for your end users. But when we talk about user interface and the workflow, everybody has a different process and workflow. So during that end user training, we get you and your users up to par on how to use your environment. With that said, I do have customers that have set up many PDM vaults, and a lot of times they'll do what we call self-implementation, meaning they've been through this process, they kind of know the ins and outs, and they're like, hey, I can do this on my own, and we're like, great, 2 thumbs up, knock yourself out. But a lot of people who own PDM in their SOLIDWORKS license have never set up a vault, and although it's not rocket science, because it's really not, you just don't know what you don't know. So that's where the implementation and where this in-user training comes in. In a short amount of time, we can get you up and running, and so that way from that point forward, you're ready to go. Now, once we complete that in-user training, the last thing that you're going to see is what we call go-live support. For larger organizations, a lot of times we'll dedicate time on site with the customer to do go live support, meaning just kind of, I call it hand holding, just kind of helping you along the process. But the great thing about our technical support mechanism is your go live support is just your tech support. So when you have questions or you have follow-up issues or follow-up clarification, you can leverage our normal tech support mechanism, which is calling into our 1-800 number or sending an email or going to our website and submitting your normal technical support question, which goes into our queue, and then we address that the same way that we would address any SOLIDWORKS technical needs. So that is the basic rundown of how an implementation goes. Those 4 major pieces: getting everything installed, getting everything configured, getting everything tested, and then finally getting your end users trained up on the system. So most people say, okay, Roland, that sounds great. That makes sense. What about all this other stuff, or what we call future phases? So what is not part of that initial setup? What are things that I should be looking out for down the road, when you're setting up PDM? The first is a lot of times people have multiple department bill of material management. So they say, all right, Roland, we have our mechanical bill of material, but then we have an electrical bill of material. Then we have a shipping list or a packing list. How do I manage all that? You can definitely leverage PDM to do that, but that's usually what we call an advanced setup. So there's usually a certain amount of extra time that needs to be committed to that. Sometimes customers say, well, Roland, I want to take my bill of material and I need to export it into our MRP tool, right? I want to share it out of PDM into another tool. That kind of falls out of that scope of your first initial implementation. One that's a key thing that a lot of people always ask about is is their legacy data. They say, all right, Roland, I've been using SOLIDWORks for 10 years. I got 10 years of data. How do I put that in PDM? The good news is PDM is built on Windows Explorer. So if you trust your data and you say it's good, it's just a cut and paste. You can literally copy and paste it from your current server into PDM and start leveraging the PDM tools. But a lot of the times people don't trust their data. They say, hey, I got redundant files. My files might not be good. I don't know who created this, blah, 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 blah. And then we need to have a higher level conversation on how to address those issues. Advanced workflow processes. So you'll see that my workflow was relatively linear. Sometimes customers say, I have a really complicated way that I approve things. And they say, all right, you know, I have these 15 different people in my organization that need to approve things at different times, and it's a little bit outside, you know, a simple workflow that you showed. ERP integration or PLM integration, that's integrating PDM into another tool. And I'll talk about that here in a second. Customizations, right? So a lot of the times our customers are wanting to do things that are outside the box of PDM. And so we can write actual custom add-ins. That's usually not going to be part of your initial implementation. And then obviously your normal IT requirements like backing up the server, backing up the database, setting up the server. Now the good thing about that, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is a lot of our customers are going away from managing their own servers. So we actually have that as a service where you can actually rent essentially one of our hosted cloud servers, which means you don't have to take on that responsibility. That could be something that we do for you along with providing the PDM application. So those are things that are kind of that you want to be aware of as you're setting up PDM, and it's kind of like eating a good steak. You want to take little bites at a time. So step one is getting it set up, using it, and then these generally fall into your future phases, which we're here to help you kind of outline and roadmap as you go forward. Now, as we kind of start getting towards the end of this presentation, the next question that I generally get is people say, well, Roland, you know, I saw you have PDM Standard and you had PDM Professional. And a lot of customers say, I own PDM Standard, I'm going to use PDM Standard, but why would I want to go to PDM Professional? What are some common reasons that I might need PDM Professional versus PDM Standard? The first is if you have multiple physical sites or multiple offices. So maybe you have an office in North America and you have an office in South America or Asia. We can handle that. But that is a function that you're going to see inside PDM Professional. What we have in PDM Professional is we have what we call replication. Replication lets you link up multiple physical offices that are not in the same geography or in the same location together, so that way everybody in all those offices is synchronized. So for example, I work in Dallas. I'm out of our Dallas office. I go and I check in some files onto our Dallas server. Then my coworker Marcus, he works in our Oklahoma office, so he wants to see those same files. So we actually have a replication scheme set up, so that way when he goes and opens something up in Oklahoma, our system, our two servers, are synchronized in the background, and they replicate that data, maintaining all that same history, all that same information, which is not really the same thing as mapping a network drive. Likewise, we have an office on the East Coast. So our East Coast coworker, Cody, he goes to open up and look at some data, and all three of us are collaborating. And when he does that, our server in the background is actually scheduling that replication for us, making sure that we're all looking at the same information. We call that replication. That tool is actually a PDM Professional tool. So multiple sites and multiple offices. Second reason that people generally are going to want to upgrade to PDM Pro, or they might need to, is they say, Roland, I have a more robust workflow, or I have multiple workflows. So for example, PDM Standard has the ability to do a single workflow. In PDM Professional, you're looking at my vault, you'll notice that I have multiple workflows. So what does that physically mean? I have a workflow, I have a process for approving engineering drawings, but then I have a different process for approving technical instructions. So I create instruction manuals, and that goes through a different team. Then I have a different process for approving general documents. And in one of my other vaults, I actually have a process for approving CNC programs for my CNC machines. So when you get out of just a single process and you want to track multiple processes, that is a function of PDM Professional. Automation. People say, Roland, I'm not lazy, but I like to be efficient. How can I automate things? Well, one of the most common things that we see people doing is creating tasks. So in PDM Professional, you have the ability to automate some common tasks like generating PDFs, exporting data out, sending notifications out, sending out or renaming files using serialization. Those are all what we call tasks that we can automate, which you're seeing right here. Here are some of my tasks, and we can automate those using PDM Professional. The reason is those require an API, and so PDM Standard doesn't have the full API. That is a function of using the full-blown version of SQL and the full-blown version of PDM Pro. So if you're really going and you say, hey, I want to automate everything, that would be one reason you might want to look into PDM Pro. Now, before I go, I just want to comment is I'll talk here in a little bit about the upgrade process. So a lot of times you don't need to jump into PDM Pro. You can start with PDM Standard because you already own it. And then as you grow into your vault and you say, all right, I'm ready to use more tools, there is an upgrade path, and we'll address that here in a second. Standardization. So a lot of my customers say, Roland, I want to standardize everything. Using PDM Professional, we have the ability to use what we call templates, which is not a function of PDM Standard. So in this case, you'll actually see I have a template from when a new purchase order comes in. So when that new PO comes in, it creates a PO for me. It starts some information in the background. It starts a new workflow, and I'm actually standardizing the creation of some of my content. Multiple CAD platforms, which is real common these days, right? A lot of my customers have inherited other CAD solutions, or maybe they're using multiple CAD solutions as a requirement for a project. So if you're using SOLIDWORKS and another CAD solution, another 3D CAD solution, and you want to leverage PDM to manage both kinds of documents, that is a function of PDM Professional. So SOLIDWORKS PDM Standard, right? Our PDM Standard tool is built for SOLIDWORKS files, all your Microsoft files, and then AutoCAD files, which is just your standard 2D drawings. PDM Professional can handle everything else. So everything outside of that scope of those file types, that's really the highlight point of using PDM Pro. System integration. Many times customers say, Roland, I'm using a workflow, and when I approve a drawing, I want to take the bill of material of drawing and I want to put it into my ERP tool so that way my requisition team knows what to purchase. Well, with PDM Professional, that is one of the functions that we have in here. And I'm actually, in my vault, exporting my bills of material, and I'm then automatically importing them into my ERP tool in the background. So that is a function of PDM Professional. So next steps, right? So to round out this webinar is now that we know what PDM is, we know the different flavors of PDM. We know that most people actually own PDM if you have SOLIDWORKS Pro or SOLIDWORKS Premium. We know the implementation process, which is installing the software, getting trained on the administration of the software, configuring the software, and then the end user training. We know the difference between PDM Standard and PDM Professional. What are your next steps moving forward? The first thing is if I was in you guys' shoes, following along in the webinar, is do you currently have PDM Standard? If you don't know if you have PDM Standard, there's a few ways that you can figure that out. The first way is if you go to SOLIDWORKS and you go to Help, you'll see there is an option called About SOLIDWORKS. If you go to About SOLIDWORKS in your SOLIDWORKS installation, at the top, it'll tell you what flavor of SOLIDWORKS you're running. So right there, it's going to say SOLIDWORKS Standard, SOLIDWORKS Professional, or SOLIDWORKS Premium. If you see SOLIDWORKS Professional and SOLIDWORKS Premium, as does mine right here, you actually own PDM Standard. So that is the quickest, easiest way to figure out if you already have PDM. If you can't figure that out, or maybe you're not a SOLIDWORKS user, you can contact us directly, and we can look up your assets and figure out what that is. Once you define, hey, do I have PDM Standard? The next thing is define your current process, right? So what are you doing today? What are you doing currently? Do you use a revision scheme? How does your team work? How many people are using SOLIDWORKS? How do you share your content with people that are not using SOLIDWORKS, right? So define what you're currently doing. And the way that I usually do that is I sit in a conference room, I get on the whiteboard, and I start creating a roadmap. The next step after defining your current process is, where do you wanting to go, right? What are your future goals, right? So most people, when they're defining a process, they see shortcomings. They say, hey, we're not tracking revisions really well, or we're constantly producing outdated parts, or our changes aren't getting in the shop floor in a timely manner. So what are your goals? What are you wanting to get out of PDM? The benefit and the reason that we want to outline those goals is that'll help us help you. So when you say, Roland, our biggest obstacle is our revision control, or the fact that we are messing up SOLIDWORKS files, or we don't know where our stuff is, that helps us outline that for you. And then after that, once you know if you have PDM standard and you've defined your current process and you know what your goals are, you can contact us directly and we can help you roadmap that and define your implementation needs and what that would look like. What that means, that would define, if you don't have PDM standard, hey, how can we get you PDM? How long will it take? How many people? And we can kind of tailor a specific roadmap to help you get going in PDM. In most cases, in smaller organizations, it generally doesn't take that long, typically between maybe 2 and 3 days. As we get up in users, that's usually where you're going to see 4 or 5 days. I've done this almost 15 years now, and very rarely, only maybe a handful of times, has it taken longer than 5 days. And in almost all those scenarios, it's probably 20 plus users. So from a timing standpoint and a project standpoint, it's relatively non-invasive. It's usually a simple process of getting going, even more simple than learning SOLIDWORKS. With that said, first thing is I want to thank everybody for their time, and I'll go ahead and open it up to questions.